It began on a night when the air felt heavier than usual, as if the sky itself was leaning closer to the earth. I was in my living room, flipping aimlessly through shortwave frequencies on an old Hallicrafters receiver I had bought at a flea market. Most nights, it was just static, comforting in its randomness, a white noise lullaby for the sleepless. But that night, the static shifted. Somewhere between two dead stations, I heard a rhythm, almost like breath. At first, I thought it was just signal bleed from a distant AM station. Then came a voice, faint, distorted, buried deep in the hiss. The words were difficult to make out, each syllable tangled in noise, but I could swear it said, North, 42.6 coordinates. The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, swallowed by the static. I wrote the numbers down without thinking, my pen moving as if the action had been decided for me. When I looked them up on my phone, I expected them to point to some government facility or random farmland. Instead, it was a patch of forest about 30 miles north of town, the kind of place hunters disappear into during the season and never come out of. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself it was probably just some ham radio enthusiast playing games. But the thing about curiosity is, once it has its teeth in you, it's hard to shake it off. The next night, I tuned the dial again. The same frequency, the same static, and the same voice. This time it was clearer, like the speaker had stepped closer to the microphone. North, 42.6. West, 73.9. The exact same coordinates. Only now, after the numbers, there was a pause, and then a single word. Tonight. Something in the tone made the hair on my arms stand on end. It wasn't a command exactly. It was more like the kind of suggestion that crawls under your skin and plants roots in your mind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper with the coordinates in front of me, a thermos of coffee at my elbow. Around 3 a.m., I gave in, grabbed a flashlight, and drove north. The road narrowed the farther I went, asphalt giving way to dirt. My headlights picked out twisted branches and skeletal trees, their shadows stretching across the path like fingers. When I reached the location, my GPS chirped and went dead, screen black, as if it had been drained. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of traffic. Just the faint ringing in my ears from the drive. I stepped into the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. The coordinates led me to a clearing, empty except for a rusted metal pole sticking out of the ground, maybe 8 feet tall, capped with what looked like an old antenna. There were no wires, no power source, just the pole, humming softly when I put my hand near it, not vibrating, humming, like a sound that wasn't quite sound, something you felt in your bones more than heard. Then, my receiver, which I had brought with me almost as an afterthought, crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. Through the static came the same voice, but this time, it didn't give coordinates. It said my name. 3 times. I don't remember driving home. One moment I was in the clearing, my heart pounding in my throat, and the next I was back in my kitchen, the receiver still in my hand, the frequency dialed exactly where it had been before. It's been 3 nights since then. The voice hasn't returned, but the static is still there, patient, like it's waiting for me to come back. And the worst part? I think I will. The days that followed were consumed by the hum of the signal in Ethan's head. It was no longer just something he heard on his radio. It felt as if it had etched itself into his nerves, an invisible thread pulling his thoughts back to that night in the kitchen. He began researching late into the night, scrolling through local archives, newspaper scans, and half-forgotten internet forums. Most people had never heard of the broadcast, but buried in an old community bulletin from 1979, Ethan found a short note. Residents are advised to disregard recent rumors about illegal shortwave activity. There is no cause for alarm. It didn't say much, but the fact that the note existed at all told him something. The signal wasn't new. At the county library, the older librarian, Mrs. Hargreave, seemed unusually tense when he asked about old radio disturbances. She didn't answer his question directly. Instead, she slid a folder across the desk, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were photocopies of missing person reports, each one dated within a week of an alleged shortwave anomaly. The earliest was from 1956. The latest was from 2014. Every report described the same bizarre detail. Before disappearing, the victims had told friends or family about strange coordinates they had received over the radio. Ethan's stomach turned cold. There was a pattern, and the signal was the thread tying them together. That night, Ethan drove out to the coordinates from the first transmission he'd recorded. The location was an empty clearing in the woods, surrounded by towering pines that swayed despite the still air. No buildings, no lights, no signs of human activity. Yet the moment he stepped into the center of the clearing, his portable radio erupted into the same static and voice. 8420. The coordinates repeated over and over, but these weren't the ones he'd followed. They were new. A sudden rustle made him spin around. In the dim light of his flashlight, he caught sight of a figure at the edge of the trees. The man, or at least Ethan thought it was a man, wore a long coat and a headset with an old-fashioned antenna jutting from it. The stranger didn't move. Ethan shouted, but there was no response. When he took a step toward him, the figure turned and walked into the darkness, vanishing between the trees without a sound. The radio went dead. Back at home, Ethan marked the new coordinates on a map. They pointed to a stretch of land near the river, not far from a decommissioned broadcast tower he remembered seeing as a kid. A strange chill washed over him. It felt less like he was discovering something, and more like he was being led, step by step, toward an inevitable conclusion. The motel room felt like a coffin. Thin walls, stale air, and the faint smell of mildew pressed in from all sides. Daniel sat cross-legged on the bed, the radio receiver balanced on his knees, its black plastic casing worn smooth from decades of handling. The hiss filled the room again, constant, whispering, almost like the low breath of something just outside the walls. He had been scanning for hours, moving the dial a hair at a time, listening for that tone, the strange three-note chime that had haunted him since he stumbled across it days ago. And then, like a hook snagging deep in his chest, it was there again. Chime, pause, a voice. Not the garbled military-sounding bursts he'd heard before, but a clear human voice, slow, deliberate. Coordinates 39.7. The rest dissolved into static before returning. Midnight. Alone. Daniel froze. His pen trembled as he jotted the numbers on a motel notepad, his handwriting jagged and crooked. These coordinates were different from the ones he had traced earlier. Different, but somehow close. The hiss returned, but this time it wasn't empty. Beneath it, layered so faintly he almost doubted his ears, was breathing. Not his own. It was slower, deeper, and it matched the rhythm of the hiss perfectly. He twisted the volume down, then up again, testing if it was interference. The breathing remained. The motel's cheap clock read 11:42 p.m. Daniel should have been exhausted, but the pull was too strong. He grabbed his jacket, slipped the radio into his bag, and stepped out into the damp night. The coordinates led toward the outskirts of town, to an overgrown service road that disappeared into the tree line. His flashlight beam caught raindrops in the air, each one glinting for a fraction of a second, before vanishing back into the darkness. The hiss from the receiver, now clipped to his belt, grew sharper the deeper he went. It was almost like the static itself was guiding him, swelling when he turned one way, thinning when he drifted off course. He began to notice a rhythm to it, like it was leading him in time with each step. A mile in, The trees parted around a clearing. In the center stood a rusted steel structure, the remains of a radio relay tower, maybe 50 feet tall. Its skeletal frame loomed against the sky, black against the faint glow of the clouds. Daniel stopped. The hiss vanished. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Then the chime returned, clear and cold in the night air. He turned in a slow circle, the sound seeming to come from everywhere at once. His flashlight beam swept the undergrowth, catching glints of wet metal. Old tools, a half-buried generator, and dozens of glass jars, each one fogged with condensation. Inside the nearest jar, something shifted. Daniel's breath caught. He took a step closer and saw what lay inside. Strips of magnetic tape, curled like black ribbons, each labeled in blocky white letters. Dates, names, dozens of them. He spotted one near the front, its label smeared but still readable. Harper, 1987. Another, Ellis, 1994. The hiss surged again, loud enough to make him wince. The voice returned, quieter now, almost as if it was inside his head. "Do you hear them, Daniel?" His mouth went dry. He hadn't told anyone his name. He fumbled for the radio, but the dial spun uselessly under his fingers. The voice spoke again, still calm, still patient. "Follow the signal. You're almost there." A sound behind him, wet leaves shifting under a slow, deliberate step. Daniel turned, flashlight beam cutting through the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, a shape, tall, thin, impossibly still. Before he could move, the hiss roared, swallowing every other sound. The light flickered once, then died. Daniel was left in the dark, the static now pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. Michael had never driven that far north before. The highway gave way to narrow county roads, then to a single cracked lane cutting through thick woodland. The deeper he went, the more the world seemed to fold in on itself. No other cars, no phone signal, not even the distant rumble of planes. The forest here was suffocatingly quiet, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. The coordinates from the night before were seared into his mind. He'd written them down 3 times, circled them, and stared until the numbers burned into the backs of his eyelids. They weren't just locations anymore. They felt like instructions, and he was following them like a man under a spell. The static had changed overnight. On the drive, it still leaked faintly through the car's speakers, but it no longer sounded random. It was pulsing now, beating in a rhythm that matched the nervous thud of his own heart. Michael kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following him. But the road remained empty. After an hour, the asphalt ended. He parked the car where the lane simply vanished into dirt and undergrowth. The forest loomed in every direction, the canopy blotting out most of the daylight. The coordinates pointed deeper in. He grabbed a flashlight from his glove box and stepped into the trees. Every few minutes he would stop and adjust the small handheld radio he had brought with him, turning the dial slowly until the static was at its clearest. When he faced the wrong way, the signal thinned and cracked. When he turned toward the coordinates, it swelled and steadied. It was leading him, just like it had at home. The further he walked, the stranger the forest became. There were no bird calls, no rustle of animals. The air had that heavy pre-storm tension, though the sky above was empty of clouds. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the leaf-strewn ground, each one echoing in a way that didn't make sense in open air. 2 hours in, he reached a clearing. The ground here was bare dirt, oddly circular, as if something enormous had once stood in its center and scorched the earth. At the far edge of the clearing, half hidden under creeping ivy, stood what looked like an old radio tower. It was small, barely 20 feet high, and rusted almost to nothing. Michael spun around and saw the coordinates. Hanging in the blackness, glowing faintly, the numbers drifted like fragments of a dream. They began to change, shifting into new digits, faster and faster, until he couldn't follow them anymore. The ground, or whatever he was standing on, trembled. The silhouettes began moving toward him, slow but deliberate. The chant grew into a roar, and Michael realized they weren't just calling something to him, they were calling him through. His vision snapped back. He was in the clearing again, gasping, the radio clutched so tightly in his hand that his knuckles ached. The tower loomed silent before him, the shimmer gone. But the static hadn't stopped. It was pouring from the speaker in a steady, low hum. The new coordinates were burned into his mind without him having to write them down. He didn't know where they pointed yet, but he knew, deep in his bones, that they were farther away. Much farther. And for reasons he didn't want to think about, he knew he would follow them. By the time I reached the tree line, the static had grown so loud in my headset it was almost a physical pressure, like the sound was pushing against my eardrums. The forest rose before me, tall pines, their trunks black against the gray dusk sky. Beyond them, I could just make out the shadow of the old transmission tower, a skeletal silhouette against the horizon. The path was barely there anymore, swallowed by roots and weeds. My flashlight beam bobbed across the undergrowth as I picked my way forward. The further I went, the worse the signal got. Not weaker, but sharper, almost aware. Between the bursts of static, I began to hear something else. The faint rhythm of breathing. It wasn't mine. When I finally broke through the trees into the small clearing, I froze. The tower stood at least 100 feet high, its rusted frame humming faintly in the wind. The base was surrounded by a chain-link fence, sagging and broken in places. Inside, half buried in dirt, lay coils of cable like veins spilling from the earth. I ducked through the gap in the fence and approached the concrete block building at the tower's base. Its steel door hung crooked on a single hinge. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me. Not rot exactly, but something stale and electric, like burnt dust on old wiring. Inside, the room was lit by a single flickering bulb. Against one wall sat a bank of dusty control panels, their dials frozen mid-readout. The static in my headset dropped to a low hiss, as if the signal were holding its breath. And then I saw them. Cassettes. Hundreds of them, stacked neatly on sagging metal shelves. Each one had a strip of masking tape on the spine with a date and a set of coordinates written in black marker. Some dates went back decades, others were recent, last week, yesterday. My hands shook as I traced the labels. Most were from places I'd never heard of, scattered across the country. And then, near the middle of one shelf, I saw it. Tomorrow's date. The coordinates matched my town. Beneath the numbers was a single word, my name. I don't remember picking up the tape. I don't remember finding the player, an old reel-to-reel deck sitting silent on a workbench. But I do remember the moment I pressed play. At first, it was only static, the same as always. Then, the hiss shifted, shaping itself into something else, the rise and fall of breath. My breath. It matched me perfectly, even when I tried to hold it, even when my pulse quickened. I ripped off the headset, but the sound didn't stop. It was in the room now, rattling through the old speakers. The reel spun on, the tape whispering out my life in real time. And somewhere, deep in the background, I could swear I heard footsteps. I backed toward the door, every muscle screaming to run, but something kept me frozen. The shelves, the tapes. There was one empty slot next to my cassette, waiting for the next date. The label space was already there, blank and waiting, like someone knew I would stand here tonight. The bulb overhead flickered and went out. In the dark, the static grew louder again, not from the player this time, but from all around me. It filled the walls, the floor, the air. And in the middle of that noise, I heard a voice. Not words, just a low murmur, impossible to place, as though it was being spoken directly inside my skull. I stumbled backward out the door into the night. The tower loomed above, black against a starless sky. No moon, no wind. Just the hum of the metal frame and the taste of copper in my mouth. I don't remember getting back to my truck. I don't remember starting the engine. All I know is that the cassette is still in my pocket. And when I got home, my radio, the one I'd smashed days ago, was on, tuning itself, searching, waiting. The air inside the tower was thick, humid, and oddly warm. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rusted metal, tangled wires, and peeling paint. The static in my earpiece had softened into something else, a slow, deliberate breathing. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the speaker or from inside my own head. I climbed the last few steps and stepped into the control room. Every wall was covered in dials, gauges, and ancient broadcast equipment. Most of it was dead, but one reel-to-reel machine sat spinning in the center, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat. The tape hissed and popped, and then my voice. Not just my voice reading this moment, the scrape of my boots on the floor, the click of my flashlight. Every sound I made echoed back to me a second later from the tape, like the room itself was recording my presence in real time. I stood frozen. "Hello?" I whispered, instantly regretting it. "Hello," my voice replied from the tape, but not in sync. It was slower, deeper, as if something inside the recording had taken hold of my words and was chewing on them before spitting them back. I backed toward the stairs. That's when I saw the other tape machine, half hidden under a pile of dusty tarps. Its reel was labeled in thick black marker. Tomorrow, my name. The date written below was tomorrow's date. My hands shook as I pulled the tape free. I wanted to smash it, burn it, throw it from the tower. But some part of me knew that wasn't possible. My fingers slid the reel into the active machine before my brain could stop me. The static roared, my stomach twisted. Then I heard it, my voice again, this time screaming. No words, just a raw animal sound of terror, echoing endlessly. Between the screams were other noises, footsteps pounding, the snap of branches, and a low, hungry rumble that I felt more than heard. And then, silence. The reel kept turning. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable, my breath loud in the headphones, and then, faintly, from somewhere far away, "I'm here." It was my voice, but stripped of everything human, hollow, wet, wrong. I ripped the headphones off and stumbled toward the exit, but the door was gone. Where it had been, there was only a blank wall of corroded metal. I turned to the windows, sealed shut, thick with grime. The only way out was down through the hatch in the floor, but when I looked, the stairs were gone too. Just blackness shifting like water. The static began again, softer this time, like a whisper pressed against the inside of my skull. It spoke in my own voice. "It's okay. You'll see. You've always been here." The red light on the recorder pulsed faster. My own recorded breathing matched mine perfectly now. I sat down without meaning to, my back against the console. My body felt heavy, like something was pinning me in place. The machine clicked as the tape reached its end. Then it began to rewind, faster and faster, until the reels spun into a blur. My thoughts blurred with them. When the tape started playing again, it was no longer my past or my future. It was something else entirely. A sound that wasn't sound. A presence that wasn't in the room, but was the room. The walls seemed to breathe. The air grew thicker, and the shadows swelled. And then I understood. The signal wasn't meant to be found. It was meant to find. The reels spun on, and my voice filled the tower again, not in fear, not in confusion, but in welcome. I heard myself inviting whoever was listening to come closer, to step into the static, to let it take them too. Somewhere far below, in the forest, the transmitter hummed to life. Its frequency spread like a slow wave across the valley, spilling into every home, every radio, every quiet corner of the night. By morning, the whole town would hear the whisper, and when they did, they would follow it, just like I had. The last thing I remember before the static swallowed me was the reel-to-reel machine clicking to a stop and then starting again with a new label on the tape. Tomorrow, you.